The Liberty Heights Fine Arts Gala was meant to be a night of celebration, a showcase of creativity, culture, and community. For Margaret Dawson, a retired schoolteacher known as Miss Dawson to nearly everyone in town, the event held special significance. At 71 years old, Margaret had spent 5 decades teaching in Liberty Heights, educating generations of children, many of whom had gone on to build successful careers. Her presence at the gala wasn't just as a guest, it was as a respected figurehead of the community. Margaret stood near a display of paintings by emerging artists, sipping her lemonade and chatting with familiar faces. She wore her Sunday best, a navy blue dress, her late husband's silver brooch pinned to her lapel, and a pair of polished black shoes that had seen their fair share of school assemblies and parent-teacher conferences. Tonight was a proud moment. One of her former students, Hannah Turner, was being honored for her vibrant artwork. Margaret beamed as she admired Hannah's centerpiece painting, a stunning mural that depicted the history of Liberty Heights, paying tribute to the generations of Black families who had built the neighborhood from the ground up. From across the room, a pair of eyes watched her intently. Russell Grant, a powerful developer with deep pockets and even deeper political connections, stood with a glass of untouched champagne in his hand. At 66, Grant was a master manipulator, known for bending rules, silencing opposition, and using wealth to buy influence. His plan to redevelop Liberty Heights hinged on one final property, Margaret's cherished Victorian home. Her refusal to sell had stalled his entire multi-million-dollar project. Grant wasn't used to hearing the word no, and tonight, he intended to change that. As Margaret congratulated Hannah, a sudden commotion broke out near the jewelry display case. The Callahan diamond necklace, a prized piece valued at over $1 million, had disappeared. Guests gasped as Victor Stanton, the gallery's owner, announced the theft. Moments later, 2 police officers, Officer Crowley and Officer Barnes, approached Margaret. Their faces were cold, their hands resting near their belts. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you," Crowley said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Margaret's smile faltered. "Of course, officers. What's this about?" "You were seen near the display before the necklace disappeared," Barnes added, his voice sharp. "That's impossible," Margaret replied firmly. "I only just arrived." Crowley's hand clamped down on her arm. "We're going to need to search your bag." "I will not allow you to." Margaret's protest was cut short as Crowley grabbed her small purse and emptied it onto the nearest table. The crowd gasped as a glittering diamond necklace tumbled out onto the white linen cloth. Margaret's heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. "I don't know how that got there," she said, her voice shaking. "She's lying," Victor Stanton called out. "I saw her hanging around the display earlier." The murmurs turned to whispers, then judgment. "I always thought she seemed too perfect," someone muttered. "Such a shame," another added. The officers pulled Margaret's hands behind her back, fastening cold steel handcuffs around her thin wrists. The cameras outside the gallery were already rolling when she was escorted out the door. Margaret's eyes scanned the crowd as reporters swarmed closer, shouting questions and flashing their cameras. Then she saw him, Russell Grant, standing in the doorway with a smug smile curling at the corner of his lips. Margaret's fear turned to something else, resolve. This wasn't an accident. It was a setup. As she was pushed into the backseat of the patrol car, Margaret closed her eyes and steadied her breath. She knew one thing for certain: her son, Adrian Dawson, wouldn't let this stand. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the Liberty Heights Police Department holding cell. Margaret Dawson sat on the hard wooden bench, her back straight, her face calm, but her mind raced. Outside the thin metal door, she could hear the muffled laughter of Officer Crowley and Officer Barnes, likely congratulating themselves on what they thought was an airtight arrest. Margaret knew better. She knew she'd been set up. Her fingers curled tightly together in her lap. "Stay calm," she told herself. "Stay quiet." Margaret had spent decades teaching children that panic never solved a problem. Now, those lessons were keeping her steady. A sharp knock on the cell door startled her. "You've got one phone call," Officer Barnes muttered as he swung the door open. "Make it quick." He led her down the narrow hallway to a desk phone. Margaret picked up the receiver and dialed a number she knew by heart. Her son's. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar deep voice answered. "Adrian Dawson, the voice said briskly. The sound of it, calm, firm, and unmistakably commanding, nearly made Margaret's composure break. Adrian, she whispered. Mom. His tone shifted instantly, softer, yet sharper. What's wrong? I'm at the Liberty Heights police station, Margaret said quietly, forcing herself to stay calm. They've arrested me. Theft. Something about a necklace. What? Adrian's voice darkened. That's impossible. It's a setup, Margaret said firmly. I need you here. You don't have to say anything else, Adrian replied without hesitation. I'm coming. The call ended, and Margaret closed her eyes. She trusted Adrian, because if there was one man who could take down whoever had framed her, it was her son. Nearly 2,000 miles away, in a secure military outpost outside Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Master Sergeant Adrian Dawson set down the phone and took a breath. At 42, Adrian had spent over 2 decades in the U.S. Army, rising to become one of the most decorated Green Berets in active service. He'd defused bombs, negotiated hostage releases, and led covert missions in some of the most dangerous regions in the world. But nothing had ever filled him with dread like hearing his mother's voice crack over the phone. I'm leaving, Adrian told his commanding officer. It's family. The older officer, Colonel Harris, didn't argue. He knew Adrian's reputation. When Adrian said he was leaving, it wasn't a request, it was a statement of fact. Go, Harris said. And Adrian, whatever this is, fix it. 12 hours later, the wheels of Adrian's rented SUV screeched to a stop in front of the Liberty Heights police station. It was nearly dawn, and the pale glow of morning spilled across the quiet streets. Adrian climbed out of the vehicle. His tall, muscular frame moving with the precise control of a soldier accustomed to operating in enemy territory. His sharp eyes scanned the building, taking in every camera, every exit, every obstacle. He wasn't here to make noise, not yet. He was here to gather intel. As Adrian stepped inside, the room went quiet. Officer Crowley, still sipping from a coffee cup, froze mid-sip. You must be Adrian, Crowley sneered. Your mom's not taking visitors. Adrian smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make Crowley shift uneasily. I'm not here to visit, Adrian said. I'm here to take her home. You think you're gonna walk in here and save the tough guy routine? Adrian interrupted, his smile fading. I know exactly what happened last night, and I know who's behind it. Crowley stiffened. Adrian leaned in closer. You arrested the wrong woman, Adrian said quietly, and you know it. Before Crowley could respond, Chief Gerald Whitman appeared in the doorway. Mr. Dawson, the chief said gruffly. Step into my office. Inside the chief's cluttered office, Adrian listened as Whitman awkwardly explained the situation. Look, Whitman said, his voice tired. The gallery owner claimed your mother was seen near the display case. Officers found the necklace in her bag. There's no security footage. Cameras went offline right before the theft. I'll admit, it's suspicious. You know it's a setup, Adrian said coldly. Someone's pulling strings, and you're letting it happen. Whitman's eyes flickered with unease. I don't know anything for sure. You know enough, Adrian pressed. Russell Grant is behind this. Whitman's silence was answer enough. Here's what's going to happen, Adrian said. You're going to release my mother on bail today, and I'm going to prove she's innocent. If you drag your feet, Chief, I'll make sure the whole country knows you're taking orders from a corrupt developer. You threatening me? Whitman growled. No, Adrian said, his voice calm and cold. I'm warning you. An hour later, Margaret Dawson walked out of the police station, her wrists bruised from the handcuffs but her dignity intact. Adrian was waiting by the SUV. You didn't have to come, Margaret said softly as he helped her into the passenger seat. You didn't have to ask, Adrian replied. As they drove away from the station, Margaret turned to him. This isn't over, you know, she said. I know, Adrian said, gripping the wheel tighter. I'll find out who did this. And when you do? Margaret asked. Adrian's jaw tightened. His eyes, once warm and familiar, now carried a hard, dangerous glint. When I do, he said quietly, they'll wish they never heard the name Dawson. The morning sun rose higher over Liberty Heights, but inside Adrian Dawson's rented SUV, the atmosphere was cold and tense. I need to know everything, Adrian said. Eyes locked on the road. Every detail from the gallery. Who was there? Who said what? Who seemed out of place? Margaret, still shaken but steady, recounted the events. The necklace was on display when I arrived, she began. It was in a glass case near the entrance, locked with an alarm system. I remember passing by it on my way in. Adrian's grip on the steering wheel tightened. And when did they claim it went missing? About 30 minutes later, Margaret replied. Right after James Turner, one of my former students, finished his speech. That's when Victor Preston made the announcement. Then those officers showed up, and her voice faltered. Then they came straight for you, Adrian finished grimly. That wasn't coincidence, that was timing. Adrian's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, and all signs pointed back to one name, Russell Grant. Russell Grant had built an empire in Liberty Heights. Not through hard work or honest business, but through intimidation, bribes, and manipulation. As the wealthiest man in the county, Grant had made a fortune buying property cheap, driving residents out, and flipping the land for massive profits. The Heritage District, Liberty Heights' historic black neighborhood, was Grant's latest target. Margaret's Victorian home stood right in the middle of it. Your house is the cornerstone, Adrian muttered. If Grant can force you out, the rest of the neighborhood falls like dominoes. Margaret sighed. I knew he was after the house, she admitted. But I never thought he'd stoop this low. You'd be surprised what desperate men will do, Adrian said darkly. And Grant's getting desperate. Later that afternoon, Adrian met with Detective Eric Mathers, one of the few officers in Liberty Heights who wasn't in Grant's pocket. Mathers was an old friend of Adrian's father, and a rare ally in a system built on corruption. Your mother's arrest was planned, Mathers confirmed. The necklace was never stolen. Preston had it stashed in his office safe the whole time. Adrian clenched his fists. And the cops? Crowley and Barnes, Mathers said. Both on Grant's payroll for years. They were tipped off the moment Preston announced the theft. They didn't even pretend to investigate, just grabbed your mother and paraded her in front of the cameras. Total setup. And Chief Whitman? Mathers sighed. Whitman's spineless, but I don't think he's dirty, just scared. Grant's got connections everywhere. The mayor, city council, even Judge Caldwell. That's why they moved so fast. They wanted your mother's reputation destroyed before the truth came out. And Preston? Adrian asked. Does he scare easily? Mathers smirked. He's a coward. If you push hard enough, he'll crack. That evening, Adrian and Mathers arrived at the Liberty Heights Fine Arts Gallery. The building was dark and locked up for the night. But Mathers had already arranged a quiet meeting with someone inside, Emma Wallace, a young gallery assistant, and one of Margaret's former students. Emma's hands shook as she unlocked the side door. I'm not supposed to be here, she whispered. If Preston finds out. You're doing the right thing, Adrian assured her. Emma led them into Preston's office. The room smelled faintly of stale cigar smoke, and paperwork littered the desk. Adrian's sharp eyes scanned the space. On the far side of the room stood a large oak cabinet with a brass lock. There, Emma said, pointing to it. That's where Preston put the necklace. Mathers stepped forward, picking the lock in seconds. The cabinet creaked open, revealing a small black safe. Adrian knelt, inspecting the keypad. Any guesses? Mathers asked. Adrian tapped 4 digits, 1965. The safe beeped and clicked open. Inside, sitting neatly atop a stack of documents, was the Callaway necklace, glittering in the dim light. That's it, Emma whispered. That's the necklace they said your mom stole. But Adrian wasn't looking at the necklace. He was focused on the stack of papers beneath it. These aren't just business records, Adrian murmured. This is a hit list. The papers detailed a years-long campaign orchestrated by Grant, targeting residents of the Heritage District. Names, addresses, financial details, even forged code violations and manipulated tax records. He's been driving people out for years, Adrian said, his voice low. Falsified fines, inflated property values. This isn't just corruption. This is organized crime. Emma's face paled. He's ruining people's lives. Not anymore, Adrian growled. Not if I can help it. An hour later, Adrian sat across from Victor Preston in his lavish home. The gallery owner's face turned ghost white when Adrian tossed the stolen necklace onto his dining room table. Where did you get that? Preston stammered. From your office, Adrian said flatly. Right where you left it. I don't know what you're talking about, Preston blurted. I didn't. You can lie to me, Adrian interrupted. But if you think Grant's going to take the fall for this, you're even dumber than I thought. Preston's face twisted in panic. I can't go against Grant, he'll ruin me. He's already ruined, Adrian shot back. I've got the records. The fake violations, the bribes, the intimidation, all of it. Either you testify, or you go down with him. Preston's breathing quickened. I can't. You can, Adrian said coldly. Because if you don't, Grant's not just coming for you, he's coming for your family. You know what kind of man he is. Preston swallowed hard. All right, he croaked. I'll talk. Good, Adrian said. Because tomorrow morning, we're bringing this whole operation down. Later that night, Adrian returned to his mother's home. Margaret was waiting for him on the porch, a cup of tea in her hands. Did you find what you needed? She asked. Adrian sat down beside her and let out a tired breath. More than I expected, he admitted. Grant's been playing this town like a chessboard for years. Margaret shook her head. I always knew he was ruthless. I just didn't think he'd go this far. He's desperate now, Adrian said. He's going to fight back. Margaret's gaze hardened. So will we. Adrian nodded, his mind already planning their next move. He knew the hardest part was yet to come, and that Russell Grant wouldn't go down quietly. But Grant had underestimated one thing, Adrian thought. He'd tried to intimidate the wrong family. The morning air was sharp and cold as Adrian Dawson stepped out of his SUV. The streets of Liberty Heights were quiet, but Adrian's mind was anything but. The evidence he had gathered, the necklace, the documents, and Victor Preston's reluctant confession, was enough to shatter Russell Grant's operation. But there was still one missing piece, Emma Wallace. Without her testimony, the case would be built on shaky ground. The forged violations, the fake theft, it all led back to Emma. She had seen everything, and if she was brave enough to tell the truth, they could bring down Grant's empire for good. But there was a problem. Emma was terrified. Adrian found Emma pacing outside a small coffee shop on Main Street. Her coat pulled tight against the wind. When she saw Adrian, her face paled, and she instinctively looked around. Are you being followed? Adrian asked. Emma swallowed hard. I think so, she whispered. There's been a car parked near my apartment all morning. Same one I saw last night. Grant's men? Adrian guessed. Emma nodded. I don't know what to do. If I testify, if I say what I know, he'll destroy me. You think you're safer if you stay quiet? Adrian asked, stepping closer. Emma, Grant doesn't leave loose ends. You know that. If you don't speak up, you're still a target, but this way, you'll be alone. Emma's breath hitched, her eyes wide with fear. I'm scared. I know, Adrian said softly. But you're not alone. I promise you that. For a long moment, she just stood there, clutching her arms. Then, finally, she spoke. I'll testify, she whispered. Adrian nodded. Good. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. That night, Emma stayed at Margaret's house under Adrian's protection. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the living room lamp. Margaret sat beside Emma, her calming presence helping to ease the young woman's nerves. You're brave, you know, Margaret said softly. What you're doing, it takes real courage. Emma shook her head. I don't feel brave. I feel like I'm about to fall apart. Courage isn't about feeling fearless, Margaret said gently. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're terrified. And I know how terrifying Grant can be. Emma wiped her eyes. I don't want anyone else to get hurt because of me. You're not responsible for what Grant has done, Margaret reassured her. But you can help stop him. Suddenly, headlights swept across the front windows. Adrian's head snapped up. He moved quickly to the door, peeking through the curtain. A black sedan sat idling across the street. Stay away from the windows, Adrian warned. I'll handle this. Moments later, Adrian stepped out onto the porch. The cold night air bit at his face as he crossed the yard. The sedan's engine rumbled softly, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Show yourself, Adrian called out, his voice firm. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, bulky, and dressed in a dark suit. His expression was cold, calculating. Evening, the man said coolly. Just making sure everything's quiet out here. You can turn around and leave, Adrian said flatly. There's nothing for you here. The man smirked. You think this is over? He shook his head. Grant's got people everywhere. Lawyers, cops, even judges. You think one scared girl's gonna change that? I don't think, Adrian replied coldly. I know. The man's smile faded. He stepped closer, voice low. You're making a mistake, Sergeant. Adrian didn't flinch. If you take one more step onto this property, that mistake's gonna be yours. The two men stood locked in a silent stare. A predator facing down a soldier who refused to back down. Finally, the man turned back to his car. Be smart, he muttered before driving away. Inside the house, Emma was still trembling when Adrian returned. That was one of Grant's enforcers, Adrian explained. He won't act yet. But tomorrow, things are going to escalate. I don't think I can do this, Emma said quietly, her voice breaking. I'm not like you, or Mrs. Dawson, or anyone who stands up to people like him. You're exactly like us, Adrian said firmly. The fact that you're scared, and still willing to do what's right, that's what makes you brave. Emma swallowed hard, then nodded. Okay, she whispered. Okay, I'll do it. The next morning, Adrian and Margaret escorted Emma to the Liberty Heights courthouse. Reporters swarmed the steps, eager for updates on the growing scandal. Adrian guided Emma through the crowd, shielding her from the flashing cameras and shouted questions. You're safe, Adrian assured her as they entered the courthouse. Just stick to the truth. Inside, Detective Mathers was waiting. We're putting her on record right away, he said. We'll take her statement now, before Grant has a chance to make a move. Emma took a shaky breath. I'm ready, she said softly. Emma's statement changed everything. She told them how Victor Preston had staged the theft, how Grant had ordered the setup, and how she had been threatened into silence. She handed over audio recordings she'd secretly saved from her phone, conversations between Preston and Grant's men, confirming the entire scheme. The evidence was damning, and more importantly, it was enough to break the network of corruption that had plagued Liberty Heights for years. That afternoon, Detective Mathers led a team of officers straight to Russell Grant's estate. With search warrants in hand, they tore through his office, uncovering ledgers, contracts, and bank statements that revealed years of bribery, extortion, and property fraud. As Grant was placed in handcuffs on his front lawn, cameras captured his furious outburst. This is a mistake, Grant shouted. I own this town, but no one listened. His power was gone, his lies exposed, and thanks to a terrified young woman who had found her courage, his empire was collapsing. That night, back at Margaret's house, Emma sat quietly on the couch. Margaret placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You did it, Margaret said proudly. Because of you, people are finally going to see the truth. I couldn't have done it alone, Emma admitted. You, Adrian, everyone helped me believe I could stand up to him. Margaret smiled. That's what courage is, she said softly. We don't find it alone, we find it together. And outside, as Liberty Heights settled into quiet peace for the first time in years, Adrian stood watch on the porch, knowing the fight wasn't over yet. But this time, the town had found its strength, and thanks to Emma Wallace, they weren't afraid anymore. The wind howled down the streets of Liberty Heights, rattling loose shutters and sending dry leaves skittering across the pavement. Adrian Dawson stood in Margaret's kitchen. A map of the town spread across the table. Pins marked key locations: Grant's estate, the police station, the courthouse, and a thick red circle enclosed Liberty Heights Fine Arts Gallery. That's where he's going to make his move, Adrian said, pointing firmly at the gallery. Russell Grant knows the walls are closing in. If he's desperate enough, he'll try to erase the evidence. Margaret leaned closer. But the necklace is already in evidence. What's left for him to destroy? Not just the necklace, Adrian said grimly. Emma's statement mentioned financial records, transaction logs, contracts, receipts. Grant used the gallery as a meeting spot for dirty deals. That paperwork's still hidden there, and if Grant gets to it first, he let the thought trail off. He'll make it disappear, Margaret finished. Exactly, Adrian confirmed. I know Grant's type. He's not just fighting to save his reputation, he's fighting to bury the truth. Margaret's face darkened. So what's the plan? Adrian's eyes narrowed. We let him make his move. And then we take him down. That evening, Detective Mathers met Adrian outside the police station. Mathers' face was grim. "Chief Marshal's in Grant's pocket," Mathers muttered. "I tried getting officers on the gallery, but the chiefs ordered them to stay away." "Figures," Adrian muttered. "We'll handle it ourselves." "You sure you want to go in without backup?" Mathers asked. "Grant's dangerous." "I've faced worse," Adrian said coldly. "Besides, I'm not going in alone." By midnight, Adrian, Mathers, and a trusted group of officers were stationed around the gallery. The building stood dark and quiet, the neon sign above the entrance flickering weakly in the night. "He'll come in through the back," Adrian predicted, eyes fixed on the alley. "Less chance of being seen." Mathers nodded, gripping his radio. "I've got 2 guys covering the rear exit in case he tries to bolt." "Good," Adrian muttered. "He's not walking away from this." They didn't have to wait long. A black SUV rolled slowly down the alley, its headlights dark. It stopped behind the gallery, and a figure emerged, Russell Grant himself, dressed in dark clothes with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. "There he is," Mathers hissed. "What's he carrying?" "Papers," Adrian muttered. "He's cleaning house." As Grant unlocked the back door and slipped inside, Adrian gave a quick nod to Mathers. "We move on my signal." Inside the gallery, Grant moved swiftly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He knew exactly where to go. Past the empty canvas displays, past the scattered paint supplies, and straight to Victor Preston's office. A safe was tucked inside the lower cabinet. Grant knelt beside it, unlocking it with precise movements. The door swung open, revealing stacks of files, receipts, and contracts. He reached for the papers, stuffing them into his satchel. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Going somewhere?" Grant froze. Adrian Dawson stepped out of the shadows, his broad frame filling the doorway. "You shouldn't be here," Grant growled, slamming the safe door shut. "This is private property." "You shouldn't be here either," Adrian shot back. "Unless breaking and entering is your idea of a business strategy." "I'm retrieving my own documents," Grant sneered. "I have a right to." "You have the right to remain silent," Adrian cut him off. "But you're not going to take that advice, are you?" Grant's hand drifted toward his hip, where a pistol was tucked beneath his jacket. Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Don't." "You can't stop me," Grant said coldly. "Not without backup." Adrian smiled thinly. "Who says I'm alone?" Behind Grant, Detective Mathers and 2 officers appeared in the doorway. One of them drew his weapon. "Hands where we can see them." Grant froze, his eyes flicking between the officers and Adrian. He knew he was cornered, but he wasn't finished yet. "I'll ruin you," Grant spat at Adrian. "I'll bury you in lawsuits. You think you've won, but you haven't seen what I'm capable of." "You're not capable of anything anymore," Adrian said calmly. "Your bribes? Exposed. Your network? Falling apart. And those records in your bag?" He nodded to the satchel. "That's enough to send you away for a long time." Grant's face twisted with rage. "This isn't over." "Oh yes," Adrian said coldly. "It is." By morning, Russell Grant's arrest was the lead story on every major news station. Footage of him being led away in handcuffs played on repeat. A powerful man brought down by his own greed. But at Margaret's home, the mood was quiet. Emma sat on the couch, watching the news unfold. She still looked shaken, but her eyes carried something else now: resolve. "You did it," Margaret said softly, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder. "No," Emma replied. "We did." Adrian leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Don't forget what you did, Emma," he said. "You were the one who stood up when it mattered most. That took guts." Emma smiled faintly. "I just wanted to do what was right." "And you did," Margaret said proudly. "Because of you, Liberty Heights will finally have justice." As Adrian stepped outside to clear his thoughts, Margaret followed him. "Thank you," she said quietly. Adrian shook his head. "It's not over yet. Grant's connections run deep, and there's still a trial ahead." "I know," Margaret said. "But whatever comes next, I'm glad you're here." Adrian's expression softened. "I wouldn't be anywhere else." The two stood in silence, watching as Liberty Heights began to awaken to a new day. A town that had once been silenced by fear, now beginning to find its voice again. And thanks to Adrian's plan, that voice would only grow louder. The courthouse was packed from wall to wall. Reporters jostled for space, cameras flashed outside, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. The people of Liberty Heights had gathered to witness what promised to be the most high-profile trial in the town's history. The trial of Russell Grant. Margaret Thompson sat quietly in the courtroom's second row, her hands folded in her lap. Despite her calm exterior, her heart pounded. Months of lies, corruption, and intimidation had brought them here. Today, she prayed, justice would finally prevail. In the front row, Adrian Dawson sat stone-faced, his military posture unwavering. He was here not just for his mother, but for Liberty Heights itself. For the families forced from their homes. For the community Grant had tried to erase. The doors opened, and Grant was let in. His tailored suit and polished shoes couldn't mask the tension in his face. Gone was the smug arrogance he once carried. In its place was a man drowning in fear. The judge entered, Judge Patricia Reynolds, a stern but fair woman with a reputation for cutting through legal games. She settled into her seat and glanced at the packed courtroom. "We will have order in this court," she announced firmly, her sharp gaze silencing the crowd. "This trial will proceed with respect for the law and for the truth." The prosecution opened with precision. District Attorney Mark Whitaker wasted no time painting a damning portrait of Russell Grant's corruption. He presented bank records that linked Grant to bribes sent to key officials. He displayed the fraudulent paperwork used to seize property from Liberty Heights residents. But most powerful of all was the recording, the cold, undeniable evidence of Grant's own voice ordering Margaret Thompson to be framed. "I don't care how you do it. Frame the old woman. Destroy her reputation." The recording echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Grant shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Whitaker paused to let the weight of those words sink in. "That," he said firmly, "is not the voice of a businessman. That's the voice of a man who believes his power makes him untouchable." The defense fought back with desperation. Grant's attorney, Wilson Beret, stood with confidence, but there was an edge to his voice. He claimed Grant's words were misinterpreted, taken out of context. He blamed corrupt employees, saying Grant had no knowledge of the false accusations against Margaret. "You'll hear no evidence that Mr. Grant himself ever touched that necklace," Beret argued. "This is a smear campaign, built on assumptions and half-truths." But the defense's confidence cracked when Whitaker called Emma Wilson to the stand. Emma's testimony turned the tide. Emma sat nervously at the witness stand, her voice shaky at first. But as she began to tell her story, about Grant's threats, about the pressure to lie, about her guilt for staying silent, her voice grew stronger. "I saw Mr. Grant slip those papers into his bag," she testified, her eyes never leaving him. "I saw him give orders to Officer Douglas to arrest Miss Thompson, even though he knew she hadn't stolen anything." Beret rose for cross-examination, his tone sharp and aggressive. "Miss Wilson," he sneered, "why should we believe you? You admitted to withholding the truth before. What makes this any different?" Emma clenched her fists on the stand. "Because I'm done being scared," she said firmly. "I'm done letting Russell Grant get away with hurting good people." The final blow came from Detective Mathers. When Mathers took the stand, his testimony delivered the final nail in Grant's coffin. He described how Grant had pressured the police force to ignore evidence and manipulate reports. He confirmed that Officer Douglas had been paid off, and that Grant's influence had poisoned Liberty Heights for years. "Mr. Grant didn't just steal property," Mathers declared. "He stole trust. He turned good officers into pawns in his scheme, and he tried to destroy one of the most respected members of this community to do it." The verdict came faster than anyone expected. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they returned, the air in the courtroom felt electric. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. On the charge of bribery, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. On the charge of framing an innocent citizen, guilty. One by one, the verdicts fell like hammer blows. Margaret closed her eyes, overwhelmed with relief. Adrian placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Russell Grant's face turned pale as the weight of his crime settled on him. For years, he had manipulated Liberty Heights from the shadows. Now, he stood exposed before the entire town. Judge Reynolds delivered her ruling with unwavering strength. "Mr. Grant," she said coldly, You used your wealth and influence to oppress, intimidate, and destroy the lives of innocent people. You turned the legal system into your personal weapon. For these crimes, this court sentences you to 35 years in state prison without parole." The crowd erupted. Reporters rushed to the doors, eager to deliver the news. The people of Liberty Heights had waited years for justice, and today, they finally had it. Outside the courthouse, Margaret faced a crowd of reporters. "I never believed this would happen," Margaret admitted, her voice emotional yet steady. "But I've always believed that truth will find its way to the surface. If you have the courage to stand and fight for it." Adrian joined her, wrapping an arm around his mother's shoulder. "Liberty Heights is stronger than one man's greed," he added. "It's stronger because of people like my mom, people who refuse to be intimidated." That night, back at Margaret's home, friends and neighbors gathered to celebrate. The Heritage District had been battered, but it was still standing. Families who had once been forced out were now fighting to return home. And this time, they knew the community would stand behind them. Margaret stood on her porch, watching the crowd with a quiet smile. Adrian joined her. "You did it, Mom," Adrian said softly. "We did it," Margaret corrected. "And Liberty Heights did it too." For the first time in months, Margaret felt peace, knowing that her home, her name, and her community's history had been defended. Justice had been served, and this time, the truth had won. The morning after the trial, Liberty Heights woke up to something it hadn't felt in years: hope. The headlines were everywhere. Russell Grant sentenced in corruption scandal, justice restored in Liberty Heights, and the teacher who took down a tyrant. Margaret Thompson's name was no longer tied to scandal. It was now a symbol of courage and resilience. But for Margaret, the victory wasn't about headlines, it was about home. The battle was over, but the work was just beginning. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, sipping her morning coffee as sunlight streamed through her window. The house was quiet, yet peaceful, no longer tainted by fear or uncertainty. Photos of her late husband, her son Adrian, and generations of students lined the walls. The memories of her life in Liberty Heights were preserved within these walls, and now, they were safe. The doorbell rang. Adrian entered moments later, carrying a thick envelope. "Mom," he said with a smile. "This came in the mail today." Margaret opened the envelope carefully. Inside were legal documents, confirming that Liberty Heights had won its case against Grant's development firm. All fraudulent property sales had been overturned, and residents who had been wrongfully displaced were being given the opportunity to reclaim their homes. "They're coming home," Margaret whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. "Yeah," Adrian replied, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They're finally coming home. The community rises again." 2 weeks later, Liberty Heights gathered for a celebration in the heart of the Heritage District. The streets buzzed with life, families laughing, children playing, and elderly residents embracing neighbors they hadn't seen in years. The once abandoned homes now showed signs of life: fresh paint, new windows, and gardens in full bloom. Local artists had come together to paint murals across the district, capturing the neighborhood's rich history. One striking piece depicted Margaret standing proudly in front of her home, her hand raised in defiance, a symbol of her bravery. Near the center of the crowd, Emma Wilson stood with a small group of students. Since the trial, she had become a prominent voice for justice in Liberty Heights, inspiring young people to protect their community's history. "Miss Thompson," Emma called out, hurrying over with a wide smile. "I wanted to show you this." She handed Margaret a booklet, a detailed collection of interviews, photographs, and stories from the families of Liberty Heights. "I wanted to make sure our story was told," Emma said softly, "so no one forgets what happened here, or the people who stood up when it mattered most." Margaret flipped through the pages, her heart swelling with pride. Each story, each face, was a reminder of what they had fought to protect. "Emma," Margaret said with a warm smile. This is incredible." Emma beamed. "I couldn't have done it without you." Justice finds its way to everyone. Though Russell Grant was behind bars, his influence still lingered in Liberty Heights. Several corrupt officials, including Officer Douglas and Judge Wilkins, faced their own legal battles for accepting bribes and abusing their power. Liberty Heights Police Department underwent a complete overhaul, and new leadership promised transparency and accountability. Chief Henderson personally apologized to Margaret for the wrongful arrest and committed to ensuring nothing like that would happen again. Margaret accepted the apology, not out of anger, but because she believed in redemption and in the power of change. "I just want this town to be safe," Margaret told the chief. "For everyone." Adrian's next mission. Days before Adrian was set to return to active duty, he sat quietly on the front porch with his mother, enjoying the warm evening breeze. "You know," Adrian began, "I've been thinking about retiring soon. Maybe sticking around here for a while." Margaret chuckled, shaking her head. "Don't you dare." "What?" Adrian asked with a grin. "I could help rebuild the neighborhood. Maybe even open a community center for the kids." "You've done enough," Margaret said, her voice soft. "This town is better because of you. But there's still work to be done, and there's a world out there that still needs you." "You sure?" Adrian asked. "I'm sure," Margaret said firmly. "Besides, Liberty Heights isn't just about the place, it's about the people. And as long as the people stand together, this town will always be strong." A new beginning. On his final morning in Liberty Heights, before returning to duty, Adrian visited his father's grave. He stood quietly, reflecting on everything they'd been through. "You always said this town was worth fighting for," Adrian murmured. "You were right." He knelt down, resting his hand on the cold stone. "Don't worry, Dad. Mom's got this." The legacy lives on. Months later, a new plaque was unveiled at the entrance of Liberty Heights Restored Heritage District. It read, "The Margaret Thompson Way. Dedicated to those who refuse to be silenced." Margaret stood in the crowd, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and former students. Emma stood beside her, proudly holding the booklet she had created. "We did it," Margaret whispered. "No," Emma corrected, smiling. "You did it." Margaret shook her head. "We all did." As the sun set over Liberty Heights, the neighborhood seemed to glow with renewed strength, a symbol of resilience, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. Justice wasn't always swift, and it wasn't always easy. But for Liberty Heights, it had arrived. And Margaret Thompson had proven that even the quietest voices could change the world when they refused to back down. Liberty Heights had survived, and now, it would thrive. Margaret turned to Emma with a smile. "Now," she said with a spark in her eyes, "let's get to work." The story of Margaret Thompson and Liberty Heights carries a powerful message about resilience, courage, and the strength of standing together. Margaret's unwavering determination to protect her home and her community reminds us that true strength isn't about power or wealth. It's about the courage to stand firm in the face of injustice. For older adults, this story is particularly meaningful. It speaks to the value of life experience, wisdom, and the importance of preserving history. Margaret's quiet strength proves that even in retirement years, one's voice can still shape the future. It's a reminder that no one is ever too old to make a difference. The story also emphasizes the power of community. When people unite to protect what matters most, they become stronger together. Whether it's fighting corruption, preserving family traditions, or simply supporting a neighbor in need, collective action can bring about real change. In our own lives, we may face challenges that seem overwhelming, but like Margaret, we can find strength by leaning on our values, our loved ones, and our belief in what's right. No matter our age, our courage can inspire others and leave a lasting legacy. Margaret Thompson's story is a testament to courage, resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. Her unwavering strength reminds us that justice prevails when we refuse to back down. If this story inspired you, please leave a like and subscribe for more powerful narratives about perseverance, community, and the triumph of the human spirit.